When you first start out in this business, the contract feels more like a formality. You've done the hard part. You've found the client, built the relationships, put together a proposal, answered every question, and won their trust. The contract is just the thing that you sign before the real work starts. So you hand it over. They sign it, you sign it, and everybody moves on. Most builders actually spend more time on the proposal than they ever spend on the contract because the proposal is what wins the work. The contract just makes it official. Welcome back to Brickonomics, the business of building. My name is Nick Scroggs, and today I want to talk about how this mindset can actually be one of the most expensive mistakes in construction. Because the contract isn't the end of the sales process, it's the beginning of the operating agreement. And everything inside of it, every clause, every definition, every sentence about risk and payment and scope and change, starts shaping how your company operates the moment both parties sign. Over the last 4 episodes, we built a complete financial foundation: how to read your financials, how to cost a job, how to model overhead, how to price for profit instead of for survival. Every system that we discussed, the job costing model, the overhead allocation, the markup allocation, the divisional pricing structure, either gets protected or it gets exposed by the contract structure that you choose. The contract is where financial strategy meets legal reality, and most builders don't find that out until something goes wrong. This episode is about changing that, not with legal theory, but with the practical operator level understanding of how the contract you choose determines the kind of company that you build. Every builder faces the same fundamental choice at some point: fixed price or cost plus. Most builders think that this is a risk question, and it is, but the deeper truth is that the contract type that you choose doesn't just determine who carries the financial risk. It also determines how your team operates, what your financial systems need to look like, and ultimately, what kind of company you become. It's not just a contract decision, it's a business model decision. Take, for instance, fixed price. You carry the risk and you control the narrative. On a fixed price contract, you've committed to a number. Everything above that number comes out of your margin. So every estimating mistake, every discovered condition, and every material that costs more than what you budgeted is now on you. That's significant exposure, but you get something valuable in return. You control the narrative. The client never sees the underlying costs. They see the finished product and the price that they've agreed to. If something gets miscoded internally, they'll never know. The billing conversation is simple. Here's the draw schedule, here's the invoice. No receipts to dispute, no labor hours to scrutinize. This also means that your team doesn't need to be skilled at explaining financial documents to clients. Fixed price keeps the financial complexity on your side of the relationship. Now look at cost plus, where the risk transfers. Cost plus effectively inverts everything. The client pays for everything: materials, subcontractors, internal labor, plus your fee. The risk shifts from you to them, but in exchange, they get full transparency into how every dollar is spent. That transparency has operational consequences that most builders underestimate. Your financial tracking has to be flawless. Every receipt cost coded correctly, every bill organized and readable by somebody who isn't in construction. A candy bar from a Home Depot that ends up on a client's invoice isn't a bookkeeping error. It's a trust problem. And trust problems on cost plus contracts expand quickly. There's also staffing implications that are significant. Fixed price requires good field managers. Cost plus requires good field managers and people genuinely skilled at financial and administrative stuff. Project managers who can produce clear reports and walk a client through an invoice at each draw without creating confusion or conflict. There's also a behavioral shift in your field team that most people don't realize. When your team is used to fixed price, they develop a default instinct that if something goes wrong, we take care of it at our cost. And that's exactly right on a fixed price job, but on a cost plus job, the same instinct becomes a problem because the client is legally responsible for those costs, and absorbing them on the client's behalf is actually giving away money that isn't theirs to give away. This is why the contract type has to be understood by everybody on your team who talks to clients, not just the owner or the project manager. A single conversation that contradicts what the client signed can create an expectation that the contract doesn't support, and misaligned expectations are where most construction disputes are born. We were actually a fixed price company when COVID hit. We'd been doing primarily remodel and addition work with some new construction mixed in, and our fixed price contracts had served us reasonably well. We had learned to estimate carefully, build in appropriate contingencies, and manage scope tightly enough that when jobs came in, came in close to where we had planned. And then material prices went sideways. Lumber, windows, cabinets, appliances, things that we had priced months earlier were coming in at dramatically higher costs by the time we went to actually purchase them. Projects that initially looked healthy at signing were suddenly underwater on materials through no fault of anyone's estimating. The market had simply moved in ways that nobody could predict. We had a material escalation clause in our contracts. It was there in the document. It was legally valid. And under the conditions that we were experiencing, we had every right to invoke it, but we didn't. And the reason we didn't comes down to something that took me a while to fully articulate. We had never actually explained that clause to our clients before signing. It was in the contract. They had signed that contract. Legally, they had agreed to it, but practically, in the real world sense of whether they understood what they were signing and what conditions would trigger that clause, there was no shared understanding. We had written the protection into the document, but we had never actually had the conversation because we'd never had to. And the idea of going to a client mid project when they were already navigating a pandemic, already stressed about a construction project in their home, already worried about the same supply chain disruptions that we were worried about, and then telling them that their fixed price contract wasn't actually fixed under these conditions felt entirely wrong. So we absorbed the losses. We made the decision to preserve the relationship and trust that it would pay us back over time. And it did. Most of those clients became repeat clients. Several actually referred us to some of our best projects. The long term return on that decision was real, but the lesson I want you to take from that story is that we should have never had to make that decision in the first place. A clause you never explained is not protection. It's a liability waiting at the surface at the worst possible moment because the moment that you need to invoke it is almost certainly the moment that the client is already under stress. And introducing a clause that they don't recognize from a document they signed months ago is a recipe for conflict, regardless of what side of the law you're on. From that point forward, we made a rule. Every significant clause in our contract gets explained at signing, not summarized, not glossed over, explained in plain language and with real examples of when it would apply. If we ever needed to invoke a clause, we want the client to say, yes, you mentioned to me that at the beginning, not, I had no idea that that was in there. That shift changed how we think about the contract conversation entirely. It's no longer just about getting the signature, it's about building the shared understanding that makes that signature meaningful. Toward the end of COVID, when we moved from fixed price to cost plus as our primary contract structure, one thing became immediately clear. Most clients choose cost plus because they think that it's going to be cheaper. They imagine that the transparency will reveal markups that they weren't aware of. They think that seeing the actual invoices will give them control over where the money goes and that that control will save them money. They believe that cost plus is the contract for the informed, financially sophisticated client, the one who isn't going to get taken advantage of. What they don't fully understand is what the implications of that contract actually are. A cost plus contract is exactly what it says, the cost of the project, all of it, plus a fee. That means material costs what it costs, labor costs what it costs, subcontractors charge what they charge, and if an estimate was wrong, if a scope item was missed, if a price comes in higher than projected, they're on the hook for the difference. The risk hasn't disappeared, it's been transferred. I've had this conversation enough times to know where it gets difficult, and it usually happens around our contingency line item. Even on a cost plus contract, we build a contingency into the estimate. Typically somewhere between 5 and 15% of the total project cost, depending on the complexity and age of the project. And almost every time, clients hear the word contingency and they think the same thing: upgrade money. They think the contingency is a pool of funds that they can dip into if they decide they want a better tile or a different fixture or an extra feature that they didn't plan for originally. It feels like a buffer that they can spend, and it's not. It's insurance. It's our honest acknowledgement that this estimate is a prediction based on historical data applied to a project that has never existed before, and that some of those predictions will be wrong. The contingency is how we protect the client's budget from errors, omissions, and price escalations that are a guaranteed feature of custom residential construction. If the expectation isn't set clearly at the beginning, the conversation when the contingency gets used always becomes a dispute. The client feels like something went wrong. They feel like the contractor made a mistake and is now charging them for it. And technically, yes, a mistake was made, but they agreed when they signed that cost plus contract to pay for the cost of the project, including the mistakes. That's the nature of this risk transfer. I want to tell you about a specific client conversation that solidified this better than anything I've ever experienced. We were mid project on a cost plus job, and some trusses that we had ordered came in incorrectly. We had to modify those trusses to make them fit the project, and the client pushed back whenever we said that they had to pay for it. They felt like we should absorb the difference, and in making their case, they used an analogy that I thought about many times since then. They said, if I buy a car and something is wrong with it, I take it back to the dealership and they fix it for me at no cost. Why should this construction be any different? Well, it's a reasonable question on the surface and deserved a real answer. The first problem with that analogy is what they're describing is a warranty, a specific guarantee that covers manufacturing defects within defined parameters. A warranty is not a blanket policy that the manufacturer absorbs all costs forever, and more importantly, the warranty isn't free. It's priced into the car. Every car that you buy already has the cost of every warranty claim, every recall, every lemon that came off the production line built into the purchase price. The manufacturer produces thousands of identical vehicles. They know statistically how many will have defects, what those defects will cost to repair, and they price that into each unit that they sell. When you get your car fixed under warranty, you've already paid for that repair when you bought the car. You just didn't see it as a line item. The second problem with this analogy is more fundamental. A car is a mass produced product. The same vehicle has been built thousands of times before. The tooling is refined, the process is repeatable, the variables are known and controlled. The manufacturer's risk profile is based on enormous amounts of historical data from an essentially identical process that's been repeated at scale. What we're building for you has never existed before. Every single input, the site, the soil, the existing structure, the specific combination of materials, subcontractors, weather conditions, and supply chain at this exact moment in time is unique to this project. There is no production run. There is no identical unit that we built last week that we can compare it against. This is the first unit off the line, but it's also the last. The risk profile of custom residential construction is fundamentally incomparable to a mass-produced product. When things cost more than estimated, it's not just a manufacturing defect, it's the reality of predicting the cost of something that has never been built before. Eventually, our client understood. Not immediately, it took a very real conversation, but once they genuinely grasped that the transparency of Cost Plus comes with the responsibility of Cost Plus, the dispute resolved, and they actually became a stronger client relationship because of it. Everything we've talked about in this episode, the risk transfer, the transparency demands, the behavioral shift in your field team, even the COVID clause that couldn't be used, all of it points to the same underlying problem. The contract creates the rules, but the contract alone doesn't create the shared understanding of what makes those rules work. For that, we've built two systems. The first is what we call the contract playbook. This is an internal document that translates every significant section of our contract into plain language for our own team. The second is an expectations agreement or a client facing document that sets the right expectations for each contract type before the project starts. Together, they do something that the contract itself can't. They close the gap between what was signed and what everyone actually understands. The playbook came from a pattern we kept seeing after we transitioned into Cost Plus. Field managers who had grown up in our fixed price culture were still operating with a fixed priced mindset. They were advocating for client discounts when a material came back in cheaper than estimated. They were passing savings back to the client on a fixed price job where we had priced for the risk of those costs going the other way. Every one of those employees was trying to do the right thing. They were being helpful. They were putting the client first, but they were operating from an instinct that contradicted the contract that the clients had signed. And in doing so, they were creating expectation that we couldn't sustain and giving away margin that we couldn't recover. You can't fix that with repeated individual conversations. You fix it with a system. The contract playbook takes every significant section of our contract and answers 4 questions in plain language. What does this clause mean? What does it require of us? What does it require of the client? And what conversations are and aren't appropriate depending on the contract type? What should a field supervisor say when a fixed price client wants to see raw receipts? What should a project manager say when a fixed price client wants to know why something costs what it costs? The playbook answers those questions before the conversation happens, so the team doesn't have to improvise and accidentally create a problem. The goal isn't to make the team feel constrained, it's actually to make them feel confident. And it changes something important about how they feel about difficult conversations. When an employee understands that following the contract isn't being the bad guy, it's giving the client exactly what they paid for, those conversations get easier. They're not enforcing a rule, they're honoring an agreement. The expectations agreement serves the same purpose, but on the client side. It's not a legal document. It doesn't replace the contract. It's a plain language guide to what the client should expect from their project, specific to their contract time, and presented at the project kickoff as a shared planning tool rather than as fine print. The framing matters enormously. You don't present it as a list of limitations, you present it as a guide to the things that you know are going to come up because in construction, certain things always come up, and now you've planned for them together. On the cost plus side, the expectations agreement addresses the contingency questions directly. It explains in plain language that the contingency is not upgrade money. It's protection against the errors, omissions, and price escalations that are a guaranteed feature of building something that has never been built before. When a client understands this at the beginning, before the first invoice arrives, the conversation when contingency gets used is completely different. Instead of feeling like something went wrong, it feels like the plan working exactly as designed. On the fixed price side, the expectations agreement addresses the transparency question. Why the client doesn't have access to the underlying cost documents and why that's actually in their interest because the fixed price structure means we've taken on the financial risk and that we manage the cost side without requiring their involvement. The most important thing the expectations agreement does is it changes the emotional context of difficult conversations before they happen. When a cost plus client calls because a line item came in higher than the estimate, and the first thing to remember is the conversation at kickoff where you explain this exact scenario, the conversation is grounded in a shared framework rather than starting from conflict. That's the difference between a client who feels surprised and a client who feels prepared. And the prepared clients don't become disputes. Before we close, I want to leave you with one question. If something went wrong on your next project, a material came in significantly over budget, a discovered condition added real costs, or a client disputed a change order, would every person in that conversation be working from the same understanding of what your contract says? Not the same opinion, the same understanding. Your client, your project manager, your field supervisor, you. If the honest answer is no, if there's any version of that conversation where somebody would be surprised by what the contract says, or where a team member might say something that contradicts what was signed, then the contract isn't doing its job yet. Not because the language is wrong, but because the understanding isn't shared yet. That gap is almost always fixable, but it has to be fixed before the project starts, not during the crisis. Here's how to start closing it. Read your own contract out loud to yourself, not as a legal document, but an operating document. Every time you hit a clause and you think, I've never actually explained this to a client, or I'm not sure my team knows how this applies, flag it. That list of flag clauses is now your first priority. Then ask a different question for each one. Is this clause part of the conversation I have at signing, or is it buried in fine print that somebody signed without really understanding? If it's the latter, if the clause exists in the document but has never been part of any real conversation, it's not a protection, it's a liability. The contract playbook and the expectations agreement are the structural answers to those problems. But you don't need a formal system to start, you just need to make one decision that from this point forward, every significant clause in your contract gets explained before it's signed. That decision, more than any specific contract language, more than any legal protection you could add, is what changes the quality of your client relationships over time. Because a client who understands what they signed doesn't become a dispute, they become repeat business. Here's what I want you to take away from this episode. Your contract is not just a form that you fill out before the work starts. It's the first real decision you make about what kind of company you're going to be on that project. It determines what your team is responsible for, what your client is responsible for, what your financial systems need to support, and what conversations are appropriate when things don't go as planned. A clause that you never explained is not protection. We learned that during COVID. We had the right language, we had the legal standing, but we had never walked our clients through what that clause meant or when it would apply. And when the moment came, when we genuinely needed to invoke it, doing so would have felt like betrayal rather than a contractual right. An expectation you never set is not an agreement. We learn that every time a well intentioned employee gives a fixed price client access to invoices that they weren't entitled to, or absorbed a cost plus mistake that legally belonged to the client. Those employees weren't being careless, they were actually being kind, but kindness without clarity creates the conditions for conflict because the client starts expecting something that the contract never promised. The contract is only as strong as the shared understanding behind it. That's why the contract playbook and the expectations agreement exists. Not to add bureaucracy, not to make the relationship feel transactional, but to make sure that every person in the room, including your team and your client, is working from the same version of reality before the first nail goes in. When you do that work up front, something changes in the quality of your projects. Difficult conversations stop being surprises and start being planned interactions. Disputes stop starting from conflict and start starting from shared framework. And your team stops guessing about what the right answer is and starts operating with genuine confidence. That's what a contract is actually supposed to do. Not just protect you after something goes wrong, but to set the condition for things to go right. In the next episode, we're going to stay inside the Contracts and Risk series and talk about something that flows directly from what we covered today: why most builders get paid late and how to fix it. Because the contract is also where your cash flow either gets protected or it gets squeezed, and the payment terms inside of it are one of the most overlooked levers in the entire business. Thanks for listening to Brickonomics, and I'll see you in the next one.